On the Newshour panel in Washington, Richard Rossow, Senior Fellow and Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies, CSIS. Shuja Nawaz, Director, South Asia Center, Atlantic Council. Michael Singh, Lang-Swig Senior Fellow, MD, Washington Institute. Maroof Raza, Strategic Affairs Analyst.
Richard, let's start with you. You know, post the big breakthrough of the Indo-US nuclear deal, the relationship has petered out. Do you agree with that? And if so, then who should be held to blame more? Which side should be held to blame more? Because that's going to be the starting point for what we achieve on this leg.
Well, the relationship has multiple legs, and I do agree that India's inability to pass a clean liability law through Parliament really eroded trust among senior U.S. government officials. Business relations maintained pretty solid during that period, although the last couple of years of the UPA government it declined somewhat. Yeah. Indian-American relations were solid, but I think they're certainly on an upswing since Modi's election. So I think different stools and different rails.
Has there been enough of a focus on India, or has the Obama administration's constant focus on the Middle East due to the escalation of various crises, put India off the radar? I mean, America's got to take a bit of the blame as well, I guess.
Well, I think India took itself off the radar. We made a big strategic bet with the nuclear deal, and the feeling in the United States administration that India cannot carry through on commitments because of the liability law passed through Parliament, I think that was the day. You can point to that day as when suddenly at the strategic level we wondered whether or not partnership with India.
Unidimensional relationship. I mean, it's not the entire relationship down to the nuclear deal. You actually think so, right?
But that was the biggest thing that we've ever tried.
You think
to really reset the strategic
What do you think, Michael?
I don't think there has been enough focus on India since the nuclear deal was concluded. And I think there have been obstacles really on both sides. Yeah. There has, I think, been an understandable focus on the Middle East. That's not by choice. That's because of events, I think. In fact, I think in part we should have been more focused on the Middle East and perhaps jointly between the U.S. and India. But I think more broadly, when it came to the pivot to Asia, I don't think there was enough consideration of how to build a U.S.-India strategic relationship in the context of what the U.S. planned for Asia. I think there are now a lot of hopes that with Modi's election, with this sort of reset, as it were, that strategic relationship can finally blossom after sort of really seeing obstacles over the past few years. But I do think we need to be realistic and patient as to what we can actually achieve, because you've got the transactional issues, the sort of day-to-day issues, which need to be resolved, and you also have the strategic relationship, and the two have to advance together.
But is there a clarity on what this relationship should be, what this relationship will be? Because, there's a sense of drift about it. I remember when Senator, John McCain confronted Nisha Biswal in July 2014, asking her to talk about what this strategic relationship was all about. She was struggling with an answer. I don't think people in Washington, from the sense I get, I don't know what sense you get, Shuja Nawaz, they don't really know what to do with the India-US relationship. There is a sense that, yes, we must work together. There's a lot of business to be done. But beyond that, it is not a defined relationship.
I'm reminded of Charles Dickens' description of Washington as a city of magnificent intentions. And I think that is the challenge that faces this administration. There isn't a true center of gravity to decision-making on South Asia. It's almost as if we are willing to ignore one of the key central points of the world economy and of global politics, yes, which is going to be South Asia as a pivot for the whole region. And this, when I say South Asia, I include Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and geographic South Asia. Even the pivot that you talked about, or the rebalancing that the United States went through, it almost gave the impression that India was seen as an afterthought, and India was invited to become a partner, but not part of the planning for that rebalancing. I think that's really critical, because India deserves a place in the discussion at a much earlier stage. And I think we missed the opportunity then. This visit, I think, will set the grounds. There's an opportunity, some meetings with key congressional leaders, an opportunity to reshape the business relationship. And I think most important, I think Prime Minister Modi is reaching out to the middle income diaspora, the small and medium-sized enterprises. I think that is the bulk of the future business relationship, which will allow it to grow from 100 billion to 500 billion trade.
Yes, but I mean, I get your point, but we can go down to specifics. But at this stage, the one issue which I want to bring to the table is, has America learned how to deal with a much larger, much stronger, much more economically vibrant and militarily and diplomatically assertive India? You know, I was reading Nick Burns' piece today. I think it was in the Washington Post, and I think he does represent a certain establishment view. And he lists out 5 things that India has not done, which make America unhappy. And on each of these issues, I felt, whether these were environmental issues, our relationship with Iran, why we confront America at the United Nations, which is why you don't support us for the Security Council, why we spoil America's party at the global trade talks level. Maroof, I got a sense, and this is what I want to pick up as we take the discussion forward. I got a sense that for America, you are a good country, you can have a good relationship with America if you're totally with America on all issues at all times, despite your own views, despite the, what your own national concerns are. You should be subservient to American foreign policy and everything, including, and of course, the nuclear liability law, that, despite what happened in Bhopal, you need to forget that your people died, you forget Warren Anderson, you forget Union Carbide, you forget all that, but you just look at purely the American perspective, and that's going to be the basis of a strong relationship with America. Now, Maroof, that's not going to happen.
Absolutely, Arnab. I think you've really summed it up beautifully, but let me sort of give a little historical perspective. There's all this talk about the largest democracy and the oldest democracy, for me, is all social chatter.
I agree with you completely, and I think there's been too much of it.
The reality is that democracies necessarily don't dance together.
Yeah.
In the case of democracies in Europe, which the Americans to a great extent have shown patience with, also recognizing the fact that Europe is ideologically, in the post-World War II era, has been totally dependent on American muscle to keep the European idea alive. Now, with that in mind, you look at this relationship with India. You want to deal with democracy. America says, let's encourage democracies. But democracy is a cacophony of noises. Democracy is argumentative Indians, to quote Amartya Sen. Democracy is multiple opinions not leading to anything. I mean, the nuclear liability law debate in India itself was reflective. I mean, you wanted a law in place before you could do business with India. We went around the parliamentary process, and this is what we got.
See, Maroof, may I say one thing? May I say one thing? May I say one thing? I think I told Richard as we were coming in, I said we will talk, as the Americans say, we'll talk turkey.
Well, I'm talking turkey.
So we will be straight, and you always talk turkey.
But can I just
the question is, if the issue is the nuclear liability law, I want his perspective also to be brought into the table. No, we'll take the conversation forward. My issue with wherever I have been in New York and Washington, spoken to all the senators and all the congressmen and everyone involved, is so angry about India's insistence on the nuclear liability law. Richard, tell me, we can't conveniently forget what happened in Bhopal in 1984. Union Carbide and Warren Anderson got away, and the absence of a liability clause gave them the escape route. So the same basic principles apply here. There will be tremendous domestic opposition without a strong liability clause which rests with the suppliers.
I understand the reasons for India's move completely.
You understand that it's difficult to do it. So then why would Americans complain about it?
It's the biggest thing we've ever tried to do between the two countries. We put it forward. We talked about breaking apart the global nonproliferation regime to bring in a new member.
Yes.
And we failed. We ultimately failed.
Why put so much focus on it?
How does the United States wake up the next day and say, let's do something else equally big? We've done a lot of other things since then. A lot of things. But there's very few things that big that are on the table.
You're saying, Richard, that the Indo-US nuke tie is one of the biggest reasons why they were sort of derailed is the nuclear deal being weighed down by due to our inability to find an agreeable solution vis-a-vis the supplier's liability.
So coming back with something
too small an issue?
Well, the companies themselves, how many nuclear plants have been developed by foreign companies since the liability law passed? 0. So it is the issue. so far. They're looking for workarounds. They're trying to figure out if there's a way to do it without legislative changes.
Can we move on? Can we keep that aside and move on?
Yeah.
No, I'm asking you. Can India and America keep that aside and move on? Say, this is not going to get sorted out easily.
Smaller things, but there's nothing else that's of the size and substance, both strategically and economically, as the nuclear deal.
That's ominous. That actually makes it sound to me, Michael, like if you don't move on the nuclear issue, then you're going to be stuck on several other issues.
The liability issue is a very significant issue, but I think it's a mistake, in a sense, to be too negative about the relationship, as I'm afraid Maroof is doing, or to boil the relationship down to just one issue, or even the energy issue down to just one issue. Because remember, the energy issue goes beyond the nuclear issue. I think we should also be looking, for example, at the issue of natural gas exports. It also goes beyond U.S.-India, because as Richard was saying, this is an issue not just for the U.S., but for other countries that might supply India. I think that when we look at the strategic relationship, the reason we need to have a good sense of what it is, and this is something that Modi needs to do while he's in Washington, is build these personal ties and begin a real strategic relationship, is that every one of these issues, whether it's IPR or whether it's nuclear liability, is going to be difficult. And without that geopolitical context, without that sense that we're supporting one another, they're even more difficult in isolation.
But being a little aware of the domestic political situation in India, I don't see, and this may not sound music to American ears, but I don't see, Richard, this whole issue of the nuclear issue being sorted out. Somebody miscalculated. Maybe Manmohan Singh was overeager. He was too keen to put the relationship on some historical path. He was not sure of his second term. He was also perhaps using it to muscle his own way in and go into history himself toward the end of his first term. But say move on.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the best thing is to move on.
And we have. Defense relations.
Yeah.
I mean, you would say that losing MMRCA, the two American platforms, losing that, would have been equally bad in the defense relationship, but what happened? The United States woke up the next day and launched the Defense Trade Technology Initiative to try to find the next way forward. So the nuclear, that's one issue. It's an important issue, but on defense, on economic relations, the diaspora, we're doing well on a lot of fronts.
And I want to get former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, K.C. Singh, who's joining us live. Maroof, I'll come back to you on that. But K.C., you've been listening on to the conversation. Good evening from Washington. Do you think it will be fair to put the entire relationship hostage to the problems that we have on the nuclear deal?
Arnab, 2 or 3 quick points. Firstly, we've got it upside down. The reason the nuclear deal came through was because the Bush administration, very early in their term, made a determination that a rising India was necessary for the stability of South Asia, stability in the Indian Ocean, and to balance the rise of China. I think it was this strategic understanding which brought about the deal, not the other way around. Secondly, we are forgetting a fundamental thing, that when the bill was there in the parliament, you first had Fukushima disaster. And secondly, it's just coincidental that a judge in Bhopal revived the Union Carbide case long after the Supreme Court had shelved it. These two incidents together fired the sentiment in the parliament. It was not that the government made it necessarily that harsh. So it was a sequence of accidental events. And don't forget, after Fukushima, there's been a rethink all over the world about the role of nuclear power in your energy mix. Germany is completely gone off it. France did an audit of all their this thing, and Japan is still wrestling with it. So India is not a case alone. I think this is an issue that can be dealt with, provided we bring about the strategic understanding between the two leaders back on the table. I think what's happened is, once that flagged and that slowed down, then all the players in different all the stakeholders, whether it was IPR, trade, climate change, they all took over. And this will happen because the relationship with the US is so complex and so wide that you can again bring it back together fairly quickly once the two leaders sit down and knock everybody on the head and say this has to be done.
Yeah. I agree with you, Casey. As Stope Talbot himself said, that there is frustrated expectation on both sides on how the whole thing panned out, both in India and in the United States. But since it is not getting resolved, and you rightly say this, Mr. Nawaz, now I want to move to other issues. There is a strategic relationship. There is a global partnership. There's a in Japan, India, America relationship. There is a relationship with China. So there is far too much at stake, I feel, and I'd like your take on it, for the entire relationship now to become hostage to how the nuclear issue will be panned out. Do you think this meeting will be that moment when we'll move on from that?
I think so. And again, I see it as an opportunity. It's a challenge for both the leaders to set a new tone, but also to set a new reality. It's very easy for us to be critical of the US or of India. But the Bhopal case, going back into history, was at a time when India was a price taker. Now India is no longer a price taker. India now is a player, a major regional and global player. It is the largest arms importer in the world. It has an enormous clout.
That's true.
And I think this is where the opportunities arise. Also, for the rebalancing to the Pacific, that the United States basically made the move and then invited India to become a partner. I see a great convergence between Prime Minister Modi's links with Japan, and even the manner in which he has finessed the China difficulties and increased the trade opportunities there. I think India and the United States could be playing a much more parallel and coordinated role in opening up to Southeast Asia and the Pacific.
A good point, but there needs to be trust.
Absolutely.
Mr. Nawaz, a relationship cannot move forward unless there is a deep and abiding trust. And second, there is a realization that there are common interests on both sides which will be served by maintaining that trust. So before I go into issues such as defense trade, defense cooperation, and the stagnated defense technology and trade initiative, which I'm sure, Richard, you would like to talk about, what about the basic issue of Pakistan and terror, Richard? You know, it is the biggest stumbling block, the misuse of American aid to Pakistan and its diversion against India, which somewhere America has been very compassionately indulgent on. What do you think, Richard?
We have
Will we see a move there?
We have a relationship with Pakistan that's deep and complex. I don't think this can be pulled apart on TV, on camera, and ultimately get to the roots of it. We've got the drawdown in Afghanistan. We've got a lot of issues, and Pakistan is a player in many of those. So there are some issues that are always going to be.
But, you know, for example, Richard, let's be very clear. America publicly, yes, Maroof, publicly and vociferously, Maroof, defends Israel. You know, but when it comes to India, for example, as a victim of terrorism, which is emanating out of Pakistan, there's a completely different approach. My view is that unless you solve the entire issue of the approach on terrorism and Pakistan, the relationship will not move with the pace at which it can move. The other issues.
Arnab, as I said earlier on, that you kind of touched a very, very important issue in which you said that America expects you to play the game by the rules it sets out for you.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Singh might feel I'm terribly negative about Indo-US relations, but I'm not. In fact, I'm pragmatic and I'm objective about it. Let me state categorically that the best possible strategic partnership India can have in the world would probably be with United States. But it's a partnership we are talking about, not the role of a junior ally. I think America needs to understand that India can get along in this world without the United States while not progressing the way that the US had designed in the next steps in strategic partnerships. But we would do well for ourselves to have you as a close senior partner, if that's the term that may make you feel happy in Washington. But let me also tell you there are three quick points. The one thing is that Indo-US nuclear liability law may not happen. Mr. K.C. Singh has rightly brought out a lot of issues, but also please understand that India's maximum capacity was to produce about 3% of its energy requirements through nuclear energy. With all the reactors in the world, and I remember some people in Washington stating that this could be a $100 billion deal because America hadn't sold reactors for 30 years before it was wanting to sell them.
We agree here that the nuclear issue, let's not get stuck on that. The nuclear issue, Maroof, is not going
The point I'm making is even if that happens, we would have 9% of our energy coming from nuclear reactors. But there are other areas we've moved forward on. You have now become our largest defense supplier, whether you like it or not.
That's true.
You know, you have surpassed the Russians, who still do have a big hold on the Indian military industry in terms of old equipment, but 50% or so of our equipment needs to become state-of-the-art and revamped, and you are a partner in that. You have received FMS deals no other country has received, worth $9 billion or more. So don't say the mother of all aircraft deals was lost,
okay, now
but you got other defense deals almost the size of that.
No.
So Manmohan Singh's government did take many steps forward.
Immediately from that loss. Exactly. I think defense has been one of the best areas of government-to-government cooperation.
Yeah, from the American perspective.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to sound too pessimistic.
Only from the American perspective, Richard, not from the Indian perspective. Because the Indian government has been very categorical that India will prefer more technology transfer than purchase of weapons.
Yep.
Right? And this was among the reasons for the raised cap of foreign direct investment in defense. So India and the US agreed to that whole defense, trade and technology initiative. It was signed in 2012. But since then, while America, as Maroof says, has managed to overtake other competitors and become this largest single supplier of defense and arms to India, the extent of technology transfer is a question mark. So what I'm reading here is, and that's precisely what Modi will try and draw Chuck Hagel's attention to. He drew Chuck Hagel's attention to it when the two met in August. So what we are saying, Richard and Michael, that, you know, we are building the relationship, but you're being a little squeamish about it. You want to be the biggest, defense supplier to India, but you don't want to give us basic defense transfer. That's a trust issue, isn't it, Richard?
The Defense Trade Technology Initiative was about co-development, co-production of next generation items.
Yes.
Now, India's complaint was they weren't far enough ahead.
Yeah.
You can buy stuff that's better than the next generation,
yeah,
but you've got to walk before you can run. I mean, the U.S. perspective on this is, sure, maybe there is other equipment out there than what we would develop collaboratively that would be, that you can buy stuff on the market that's a little bit better than what we develop. But until we get the muscles on both sides working for collaboration. It is. The bureaucracies on both sides don't understand.
Richard admitted, America isn't very generous on these issues. India is.
Not
and
day
India
one.
Has shown
not day
much
one.
More, not day one.
Year 10, year 20. It takes time.
Michael, what do you think?
Time.
Well, yes, it may take time, but the steps have to be taken.
Just a quick rebuttal.
Let's get Maroof.
And the fact is that it's not that we don't have technology competence. You reached Mars on 22nd of September. We reached on 24th of September. So we can live up to expectations provided you're willing to transfer technology.
I think.
And America is looking for country with skill, with ability to make cheap technology, which maybe not will make the pockets go tight, bigger of the big defense companies here, but it can expand your reach.
No, you see, America has a big appetite. So what we've done so far, and my feeling is, Richard, that we have whetted America's appetite with the billion-dollar deals that we've done, especially over the last 8, 9, 10 years. And now we need to work towards the technology transfer part. Michael, yes,
I think that
Michael, you better come in yourself, otherwise between Richard and Maroof, you'll get left out.
My sense is that the DTTI has been a disappointment, I think, to both sides. And I think it needs to be reinvigorated, and that hopefully could be one deliverable from the Obama-Modi meetings here. And there was a very good op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by John Kyle, former U.S. Senator, and Roger Zakheim on just this issue about how we can reinvigorate the DTTI. Yeah. But I think, too, Arnab, it gets back to some of the points you were making about trust.
Yes.
Because I think that the defense relationship will blossom only in an environment of trust and sort of strategic understanding. And so let's not only look at DTTI, but let's look at how we improve mill-to-mill engagement, bring Indian officers to the United States and so forth to build that trust.
In fact, as we are bringing this broadcast, Michael, just want to sorry to interrupt you there, but while we are talking about this, there is a big India-US military exercise which is actually going on right now. We were getting pictures of that, so that trust can be built
on
up.
the strategic issue. I think that on these tech transfer issues where we need to have more trust with one another, we need to have a deeper strategic understanding. I think if you look at Asia, for example, it's not a matter of India doing what the U.S. wants or the U.S. doing what India wants, but I think you actually see a clear alignment on many issues in Asia, for example, on China, on Afghanistan.
In terms of potential?
No, I think in terms of the way the two countries see the issue and their interest in the issue. And I think you could make the argument, Arnab, even on Pakistan, you see many areas of alignment between the U.S. and India. And I think it's important that we build on those areas of alignment, especially in Asia, because as you get beyond Asia, I think the strategic alignment decreases, rather than only focusing on the disputes or on the negative aspects.
Yeah, my take on that is that as far as Pakistan is concerned, and Shuja Nawaz Sahab, I want to come to you. And one of the the facts is that vis-a-vis Pakistan, America knows. He was polite. He called it a complex relationship. Some called it a relationship of. I thought only the British were subtle. So my takeaway is the Americans can be subtle when they want to. No, but the fact is, Shuja Nawaz, that the problem is there. Everybody knows. Now the question is, we understand that you have to have a relationship with Pakistan. You funded, America has to have a relationship with Pakistan. But at the same time, not at the cost of Indian interests. Do you see that happening there? Because Modi will raise this quite strongly from his when he meets Obama. He's very clear. He was clear at the UNGA. He was clear when he called off the talks. I'm pretty sure he's going to be clear when he meets Obama on it.
Let me first address the issue of trust between the US and India. And I think that can only come through experience and verification.
Yes.
As you go through this process, I think there will be more opportunities for the US and India to interact. And then many of these doubts and misgivings will be erased. There's no other way. Otherwise, every time you hit an obstacle, you throw up your hands and say, this is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
It will not get you anything. On Pakistan, I think India has a much stronger interest in resolving issues with Pakistan directly. India has traditionally not wanted to bring in third parties.
Yes.
India has very jealously guarded that space. The Pakistanis occasionally have tried to bring in the Americans to arbitrate or whatever, but it doesn't work that way. And I think it's really what Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Sharif can work out amongst themselves. And terrorism now is no longer confined within borders.
Yes.
What happens in Afghanistan affects Pakistan, affects India.
Yeah.
And I think it's very critical that they go back to the pre-Mumbai days when they actually signed a protocol on counterterrorism and see if they can revive that protocol and let India and Pakistan work out some practical ways and then gradually rebuild that trust, because the militancy in Pakistan is going to be the biggest threat that the Pakistanis will face.
Yes.
That militancy has a contagion effect within India too, and there's a global effect. You know, with the IS movement now, the Indian Mujahideen, the Huji out of Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, we are now talking of a global contagion that can only be resolved if the countries work together.
Again, sir, you call it a contagion, which means you talk about it like some kind of a contagious disease which moves through osmosis between countries.
It is.
But I'd like to point out to you, Shuja Nawaz, that it is not. In the case of Pakistan, Pakistan has been trying to deliberately infect parts of India with the issue of terrorism. And the reason why the talks were called off, and I'd like to get Maroof in to respond to you, the reason why the talks were called off is because Pakistan chose not to speak to the government of India and instead speak to a motley group of so-called separatists who, it is well known, have been on the payrolls of the ISI, which in turn supports the Haqqani brothers, which in turn supports the Lashkar-e-Toiba. So the separatist ISI, Haqqani network, Pakistan military, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa network is one loose structure. And what India is saying is, we want to talk to a democratically elected leadership in Pakistan. We will talk to you, but only with that kind of a leadership will be a serious conversation. If you want to reduce it to the level of a spectacle by talking to people who've never even fought an election in a local municipality in Kashmir, then it is going to be insulting the people of Kashmir. But nevertheless, I don't want to reduce this to,
Well, let me respond to that. I think you can throw your hands up and say we're not going to talk.
No, we are going to talk, but we're going to talk
anywhere.
with the government to government.
I would suggest, absolutely, I agree with you. I think I would suggest is to rise above that and say to Prime Minister Sharif, let's get together and sort this out.
But this was said to Prime Minister Sharif 1 month back, and it was being said even now.
Well,
and as Sartaj Aziz rightly admitted, in retrospect, when he said that it was our mistake to try and needle India. You see, sir,
and
I actually, I must warn you, Shuja Nawaz, I often fall into the terrible temptation of joining in as a panelist, and you're drawing me into a conversation which I would much rather avoid, because I feel my distinguished colleague Maroof is much better equipped to give you a reasonable answer to that. But what we are basically saying, we want to have a conversation, but a conversation on kind of terms that any civilized country, two countries speak to each other. Maroof.
Mr. Nawaz, I have great respect for you and for your writings and your views, but let me sort of respectfully disagree on one or two issues. One is that when you talk about, Pakistan being battered by terrorism, and Pakistan, therefore, if it doesn't receive India's cooperation, is not going to be able to contain that menace, which will eventually spread to all directions from Pakistan. The facts of the matter are, within Pakistan, there is a clear divide between the terror groups that the army is battling in West Pakistan and Waziristan and elsewhere, many of them who were earlier seen as strategic assets but now are biting the hands that fed them. On East Pakistan, which is facing India's borders, the army is not battling them because there is more or less a given understanding between the Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa, call them what you may, between their ilk and the military, that we will not trouble you in these troubled times. Yeah. And therefore the Pakistan military uses them both to needle India or give them safe passage to enter into J&K through the very heavily defended line of control. So there is that issue. But going now to the larger strategic point, I think India itself is very conscious of the threat of terror that emanates not just from Pakistan but from West Asia. They have some connectivity in terms of ideology, but not too much of physical connect. We are conscious, we are alert to that. We have begun to quickly respond to those elements in Indian society which are getting weaned away. But more importantly, I think what the US and my friends in the United States need to understand, that why we need a strategic partnership with the US and why we need the US to clearly define red lines is because, to quote Professor Stephen Cohen, is that India is friend but not an ally. Pakistan is an ally but not a friend anymore. And so therefore, that with Pakistan, you may have your hands deeply dug into certain old past historical baggage that you have. But please understand that Pakistan is more likely to wean away in the direction of China than it will wean away in the direction of Washington.
KC, and let's bring the discussion away from Pakistan once again for a bit, because I felt, and KC, your take, you've been a senior Indian diplomat for so long. Would you think, KC, that this time that Mr. Modi might keep the focus entirely on trying to remove the economic stumbling blocks and the areas of defense, trade and cooperation, and, for example, visa issues and other issues which also need to be looked at in order to make this visit a breakthrough visit? Because on the issue of terrorism, Modi is very well briefed, KC. He would know that he's talking to a president who only yesterday has admitted that he faltered in his assessment of ISIS. I mean, Obama has hardly got any terrorism or counter-terror issue right in the last few years.
You see, we must go back just 2 days to what Prime Minister Modi told the UN General Assembly. He took up three basic issues. He took up terrorism, and firstly he took up Pakistan, and he very clearly said, the door is open, but you have to create appropriate conditions, and we will not negotiate with the terror shadow. So I think there he left it. So that is as far as Pakistan is concerned. But then he went on to also laud, where he was addressing it to President Obama, the desire to fight ISIS. He said it's a very good thing that terror in West Asia is being fought. Now this would be a signal to Washington. It is possible that President Obama may raise it with him and say and ask him what India is willing to do, because you remember that even Vajpayee was asked by President Bush to send troops to Iraq. So I don't know what would be the Indian reaction, but the issue has been raised by Prime Minister Modi. Now, as far as trade is concerned, he again raised it in his address to the General Assembly, but he said there should be mutual consideration. Now, therefore, this is going to be an issue which will come up. He'll have to elaborate it. Mutual consideration is that US and India have to compromise where the food stocks issue has to be dealt with. Then India steps aside. We don't have a problem as far as the trade facilitation agreement is concerned. I have a suspicion a compromise will emerge from the talks. Finally, it's climate change, because both India and China ducked the summit, which was 2 days before the high-level segment in New York. But Prime Minister there, I thought, was a little wishy-washy in his address, because he talked of yoga and lifestyle changes, etc. But I think US is going to ask him very clearly what is the Indian position, because he also said equal but differentiated responsibility, which is normally a euphemism for saying you do all the things that you have to do because you caused the carbon, created the greenhouse gases. No, don't stop us because we are in the initial phases of getting there. But I don't think India can sustain that beyond a stage because the Chinese have started moderating and diversifying their energy mix. Therefore, this will come up.
But we have to look at our national interest.
Which Obama is focusing
no, but we have to.
Will be on the table.
But Casey,
and a solution.
How should we deal with it?
With the trade issue. Well,
I'm glad that we're talking about contentious issues. Let's play some of those. Let's actually pick up those 4 or 5 issues, Michael, which Nicholas Burns wrote today about in the Washington Post. And Casey raised the issue of the fact that India does not take the same stand as the United States at environmental summits. But why should we? We are a developing nation. We cannot have the same standards, vis-a-vis carbon emissions that the developed world prescribe to the rest of the world. Developed worlds have exercised their right to pollute. And developing countries are saying that we can't have such rigidly prescribed standards. We have made our own plans to cut carbon emissions by 60% by 2020, which I think, and 2040, which is quite ambitious. But Modi is a development man, an economic growth man. You can't have 8, 9, 10% growth at the same time and satisfy America on environment issues at global platforms. Will this be a stumbling block, Mike?
Well, I think it is a stumbling block with the Obama administration because this is a big political priority for President Obama. It's a controversial issue here in the United States. But, and obviously the United States has steps of our own that we need to take on this issue if, in fact, we're serious about reducing emissions. I do think, though, that the stance taken by the Indian government on this, it is disappointing to the United States, especially in contrast to the approach that China has taken. Simply pointing back towards sort of historical responsibility, I think is not going to be a persuasive or a satisfactory response from the point of view of either the United States or others. And I think
what's the solution, Michael? Is there a solution anywhere, Richard, on this?
I don't think there's an easy solution. I mean, you look at what India has to do if they're to actually commit to serious things on environment degradation, and the fact that it's only the central government that's attending these talks. Like, to me, that is like one of the fundamental flaws. You can't have a conversation without key state leaders in India involved as well, because you talk about power production is one of the main areas of pollution. And the central government has got very little controls over that versus the state government. And how do you convince state governments in Bengal and Tamil Nadu and places like that to commit to things? I saw this. A lot of the American investment initially when India first began to open was in the power sector. And power grids in India only dispatch the lowest cost units, which is coal, which is, it's the cheapest fuels as well. So the questions, unfortunately, India, not every group that's important in this debate is actually at the table at the same time. So I don't even think the right players are at the table to even talk about it yet.
Now, so are these kind of issues going to come up in these talks in Washington, you think? Or is it going to be far more general?
It'll be page 2, page 3. I don't think it'll be page 1.
It's not a Modi conversation with Obama.
No, Modi wants economic development, and whatever the president can do to facilitate that, I think, is the primaries for conversation.
So what about for example, in India and America's different position at the global trade talks? India refused to sign on the trade facilitation agreement at the WTO because the 10% cap on food subsidies will make life impossible for a poor country to feed its poorest people. And I don't think any government, it was not just a Congress government priority, the BJP will not give up on the food security bill, which is now an act. So I don't see any room to move at all on that. So what's going to happen?
Business has got two minds right now when you talk about India. In Washington, in the business policy universe, there's a lot of concern. There's concern about the patent issues. There's concern about the local manufacturing rules, concern about cross-border tax. And trade facilitation for that group says this government may not be any better than the others. The other group in business, the ones that actually make decisions on investments, though, like the numbers so far are stunning. FDI is up 47%. Foreign institutional investment is already 3 times higher than it was last year.
Despite our position on the nuclear deal, despite our position on global trade talks, and despite our position on environmental issues,
real business is
happening.
Yep.
So what's the complaint then? Why doesn't America let India do what it wants to do on the other issues and not let that be an impediment in the bilateral relationship?
We'd like everything perfect.
Well said. It won't happen that way, Richard.
It'll get better, though. It gets better over time.
You think it will, Richard, as long as there's understanding.
Look, I think that on the business and trade issues, I think the key thing to understand in the United States is that these decisions will be made, as Richard said, by the private sector.
Yeah.
The private sector will look at the investment and the trade environment in India, make its own decisions. It won't take direction from the White House. I think what the U.S. and India can do together together, though, is very significant. I think a bilateral investment treaty, for example, should really be one of the focuses of the President Obama's meeting with Prime Minister Modi. There are some significant obstacles, but I think it would be something which would help unlock further investment and trade.
No, you see, Michael, I'm just trying to understand where is the movement going to happen? On all the so-called issues which some people say America has a problem with India. See, okay, private sector business needs to happen, investments in certain areas need to happen, FDI limits need to be raised, and I guess there needs to be some openness from America as well. But you're not going to make us change, for example, our good relationships with Iran.
No, but
India has voted repeatedly against Iran at the IAEA, but we have our independent foreign policy on Iran. We can't compromise with them on the issue of non-proliferation, but we have a relationship.
I think that, these things...
With Tehran. So what's going to happen to that?
These things have to happen in concert with one another, I think. We can't reduce the relationship to a series of transactions because each one of these issues is difficult in its own right. And hopefully we'll see some forward progress, deliverables as we call them, on the economic and energy and climate issues and others. But there also has to be some forward momentum on this issue of the strategic relationship. Yeah. Seeing eye to eye, especially within Asia. Yeah. And as we look outside of Asia, I think we should have conversations, but they're going to be more difficult.
That's a practical approach.
On the economic front, there were really four big buckets of issues that American companies were complaining about. It was patents, it was lack of progress on FDI caps, it was cross-border tax issues, and local manufacturing rules. Okay. And two of the four, we've already seen major movements by the Modi government. Yeah. Lately announcing a panel at CBDT that's going to review any attempts to use the retrospective clause in cross-border taxation. They've moved FDI caps in a couple of sectors already. So we have seen movement on a couple of the areas that companies are bringing up. And that may be part of the reason, too, that at least a large group of companies are actually investing and putting money in. The real dollars are moving already.
So strategic issues take a back seat. Shuja Nawaz, you think so? Strategic issues take a back seat because,
No, they don't. I think
you don't think so?
They remain alive, and I think India can do a lot on its own within the neighborhood also, particularly on climate and environment change, with China, with Nepal, with even Pakistan, because it is now being affected by what appears to be a secular shift in the monsoon. And that's going to be affecting its ability to deal with the flash flooding that we've seen in recent years, also to deal with deforestation, silting of dams, and so on. The possibility of creating clean energy rather than polluting energy from hydropower means that you work with your neighbors. Bring the Chinese in, bring the Pakistanis in, bring the Nepalese into that equation, and you suddenly have a momentum that you are no longer bound by the US-India dependencies, but you create your own network within the region. On Iran, I entirely agree. I think India needs to play a more positive role, helping the US and the West see Iran in a new light, allowing the reformers in Iran to strengthen their position, to help with Afghanistan.
No, but India has consistently voted with the United States and against Iran in every instance when there has been a vote regarding Tehran's nuclear program.
And
so we have shown our commitment.
Despite that, it has a relationship with Iran.
Why can't we? Why can't we? No, my question is. My question is I'm coming to a very fundamental issue.
I'm agreeing with you.
Why can't we? Why can't? Does that mean we should now start voting as a bloc at the United Nations?
No, I'm agreeing with you.
It's not going to happen.
Just listen. With Iran, India needs a relationship, needs to persuade the West to open up the relationship there so that you can have trade for energy.
No. I'm on strategic issues, Mr. Nawaz, and I think we have a right to ask, for example, Richard, and I'm not saying this only to be provocative, but for example, these homilies also from America, human rights, speak with us on human rights, you speak with us, don't have a relationship with Iran. Well, I mean, India voted, for example, Richard, at the UN Human Rights Council, condemning Israel's rocket attacks on Gaza that kill hundreds, including young women and children. America, which is a so-called protagonist of human rights, did not. Should India have been a mute spectator then?
I don't think we hold India up as having to toe the U.S. line on a lot of these global issues necessarily.
I think many people do.
They dream of it, but I don't think it's expected. I don't think it's going to be an obstacle to the talks that are about to happen here in Washington, D.C. I don't think it's going to be brought up at all. I don't think it will be brought up at all.
Yeah.
Let me say on Iran,
I think that... You're sure of that?
Nobody's sure except one person in the United States. So
Who's that one person?
President Obama.
Is he sure of anything these days?
He's sure. He's sure he wants a closer relationship, and hopefully this summit will get us there.
Yes, Mike.
On Iran, I think, look, the India has, in many ways, you're short-selling India on this, Arnab, because India has supported, as I think you said, the sanctions, has voted with the United States, has been, I think, helpful from the U.S. perspective in that view. In fact, U.S. legislation has also carved out the ability for India to maintain sort of some of its relations with Iran. I think what the United States would like to see from India is for India to actually use that positive relationship with Iran to say to the Iranians, you need to make a nuclear deal that can allow you to get past this obstacle and therefore have better relations with the world. I think India should not see its relationship with Iran as purely somehow bilateral or mercantile, but should use it as a global player to try to bring Iran into the international fold.
In fact, Arnab, to that extent, Michael's point, it was with some kind of American nudging that India made an investment in the Chabahar port in Iran to create another access route into Afghanistan.
That's true.
So let's not forget that.
Okay.
And
Maroof, I can't go into details now. My last question to KC. KC, in about 1 hour from now, maybe 55 minutes from now, Modi will be speaking at the Council for Foreign Relations. I'm told he'll be taking a few questions as well. A lot of people will be looking forward because that's going to be like his forward-looking foreign policy statement. What do you expect the thrust to be, KC?
I think he'll be a little different from his UN address because now he is speaking to an American audience. So this will be a bridge between the UNGA address and his talks in Washington. So it will be definitely addressed to Washington and to an American audience. So he'll have to flesh out some of these issues. He'll probably talk of a strategic engagement. He'll talk of the bigger issues of the two countries together, the commonality of values, etc. I don't expect him to get into the difficult issues of where the differences are. But essentially, it will be at a philosophical, strategic, broad brush painting of generally a feel-good speech, which creates the right environment for him before he arrives in Washington.
Yes. Well, KC, I know you'll be looking forward. So will I. So will all of us. We'll be watching his speech at the Council for Foreign Relations. So far, fairly successful visit. What I take away from this conversation, which I found very interesting as part of our Newshour Washington Roundtable, is that there is a lot of pragmatism on both sides, and I think we're going to have to see a lot of give and take. The potential is immense, and I think the business potential for it to grow, there might have to be a stronger element of trust in the strategic relationship as well. Let's see if the ice breaks. Keep watching. I'm back with another panel and the stories in the build-up to Narendra Modi's speech at the Council for Foreign Relations. See you in a couple of minutes.